He handed his car keys to a complete stranger at an airport and didn't know if he'd ever see them again. The world of Ethan Hayes was a precisely engineered clockwork machine. Every gear moved exactly when and where it was supposed to. He didn't merely run one of the fastest-growing logistics companies in the region. He commanded it, his steel-trap mind anticipating problems 3 moves ahead. Risk was an equation, emotion was static, and control was the bedrock upon which his entire spectacularly successful, yet somehow solitary, existence was built. Today, that meticulously crafted reality shattered on a stretch of asphalt just 10 miles from the airport. He'd left his sprawling suburban home with time to spare. A good hour, in fact. Traffic reports had been crystal clear. The contract he was flying out to sign was massive. A deal that would effortlessly double his company's freight capacity and cement his reputation as an industry powerhouse. All he had to do was show up, shake hands, and sign on the dotted line. But then, the highway turned into a catastrophe. A jackknifed semi-truck had spilled its payload of industrial-sized PVC pipes across 3 lanes. Thousands of cars sat motionless under the merciless midday sun, turning the interstate into a shimmering, miserable parking lot. Ethan checked his custom-made timepiece every 30 seconds, his jaw clenching so hard he could taste the metallic tang of stress. He tried everything. He called his assistant, who frantically scanned alternative routes. He rerouted through convoluted back streets until GPS screamed, recalculating, in futile desperation. He even seriously considered abandoning his luxury sedan and running, suit jacket flapping, for the terminal. None of it mattered. He arrived at the gate profoundly defeated, his lungs burning with the useless urgency of the last hour. The gate agent, a young woman whose eyes held the practiced, detached weariness of someone who gives bad news 100 times a day, apologized with an inflection that barely registered. The flight was gone. The next available seat was 6 grueling hours away, scheduled for 6 p.m. Ethan didn't argue. He simply nodded, took the new boarding pass, and walked into the sprawling terminal with his carry-on bag slung heavily over his shoulder. The airport was a screaming vortex of frantic motion and indifferent noise. Everyone was rushing, pulling roller bags, faces buried in screens, all driven by a singular, frantic purpose. He found a relatively quiet corner near the floor-to-ceiling windows and slumped into an uncomfortable plastic seat. He opened his sleek laptop, attempting to dive back into emails, but his focus was shredded. He knew with sinking certainty that his chief competitor, a ruthless executive he privately nicknamed the Shark, would hear about this delay. They would smell the momentary vulnerability, and they would certainly wonder if Ethan Hayes was losing his grip. He slammed the laptop shut. His neck was rigid, his shoulders knotted tight. He was a man biologically opposed to stillness. Yet here, in this sterile, overlit waiting area, his impeccably structured world had ceased to turn. There was nothing left to do but wait, a concept utterly foreign to him. It was in that forced moment of silence that he saw her. She was tucked away, hauntingly still, near the exit leading to the parking garage, right in the deep corner where the human flow subsided. Most travelers surged right past, their eyes blinded by their destinations. She wasn't panhandling or making noise. She simply sat on the floor, her back braced against the cold wall, knees pulled close to her chest. She didn't fit the scene. She was young, perhaps late 20s, with dark hair pulled back into a simple, loose ponytail. Her jeans were worn thin, and her faded jacket looked like it had braved more than a few cold snaps. But her face was clean, quiet, radiating a strange, contained dignity that resisted pity. Ethan noticed her because of her eyes. They weren't seeking help, and they weren't defeated. They were wide, deep pools of brown, staring intensely at a world only she could see. They were searching, and they suddenly, completely, locked onto his. Against every warning bell ringing furiously in his mind, the private alarm system he had built over years of boardrooms, negotiations, and betrayals, his feet kept moving. He drifted toward the woman with the quiet inevitability of a compass needle turning north. The terminal noise, the chaotic hustle of folks desperately trying to catch flights or find baggage, seemed to fade into a dull, echoing blur as he approached her. He stopped a respectful distance away, hands shoved deep into his pockets, trying desperately to maintain the facade of a man who was merely observing, not participating. The woman finally lifted her gaze. It was a shallow, acknowledging movement, not one of expectation or dread. She offered nothing, no plea, no shame, just an utterly hollow acceptance of her current station. Ethan felt a familiar, uncomfortable tension deep in his chest. This was the moment of decision. This was the moment when he could buy his way out of inconvenient empathy. He reached into his leather wallet, the gesture almost reflexive, practiced, pulling out 2 crisp $20 bills, $40 for a clean conscience. He held the money toward her. A small, anonymous token to bridge the gulf between his tailored suit and her tattered world. She didn't flinch. She looked at the bills in his hand with an unnerving detachment, then slowly raised her eyes back to his face. She didn't reach for the cash. Ethan frowned slightly, internally cursing the awkward pause. This wasn't how the transaction was supposed to go. He was about to spout some meaningless platitude when she finally spoke, her voice surprisingly steady, pitched low like the quiet murmur of a river. "I don't need money," she said simply. Ethan blinked, utterly blindsided, feeling a wave of confusion wash over him. "I need a car," she continued, her voice gaining a profound, steady gravity. Then, astonishingly, she reached up and gently, not fiercely, wrapped her fingers around his wrist. Her skin was startlingly cold, and the sudden, intimate contact sent a sharp, electrical current up his arm, instantly quickening his pulse. He stared down at her hand, a pale anchor against the expensive fabric of his shirt cuff. He looked back at her face. Now there was an intense, raw clarity in her eyes that made his throat tighten painfully. This wasn't a cheap con. This wasn't a hustler's game. This was necessity. "I need to go home," she whispered, the words sounding ancient and heavy. "Just let me borrow your car. I'll bring it back. I promise you, I will." ... Ethan instinctively pulled his hand back, snatching his wrist away, and she released him without resistance. His mind immediately detonated with professional alarms. Liability, risk management, exposure. This was insane. She was a complete stranger. Handing over his keys was the kind of spectacular, reckless idiocy he had spent his entire adult life successfully avoiding. "I can't do that," he managed, the denial coming out weaker than he intended. She didn't argue. She simply held his gaze for a long, agonizing moment, then quietly lowered her eyes back to the scuffed linoleum floor. Her shoulders drooped with quiet, crushing finality. And in that moment of resignation, Ethan felt a fierce, twisting sensation in his chest, the same helplessness he'd felt years ago when his daughter, Emma, was deeply hurt, and there wasn't a spreadsheet, a forecast, or a rational explanation in the world that could possibly fix it. He should have walked away. Every pragmatic fiber in his being demanded it, but instead he stood rooted, staring down at this woman, and asked himself the only question that truly mattered in that vast, indifferent terminal. What if she's telling the truth? He ran a weary hand through his hair, acutely aware that the world kept rushing past them. When he looked down again, she met his eyes, yet the plea was gone, replaced by quiet, devastating acceptance. That look undid him. It cracked the carefully constructed veneer of the man he had become, reminding him of the younger, more hopeful version of himself, the one who still believed that some things were worth the risk. Fiercely battling the siren song of caution, Ethan reached into his pocket and felt the familiar, cold weight of his car keys. His consciousness screamed at him to stop, to protect himself, but his hand moved anyway. He pulled the keys out and held them aloft, staring at them as if they were suddenly the most foreign, dangerous object in the world. The moment hung there, Suspended in the bright fluorescent haze, an impossible choice between safety and salvation, Ethan extended his hand. The metal keys dangled precariously, a small, silver gauntlet thrown against the wall of his perfectly ordered life. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them moved. Ethan could feel his pulse hammering an erratic rhythm against his ribs. This wasn't just a mistake. This was a 5-alarm professional and personal meltdown. Every instinct he had meticulously honed over years of high-stakes negotiations and ruthlessly calculated risks was screaming at him. Danger, abort, protect the perimeter. But he didn't. He held the keys steady, anchored by a deep, inexplicable conviction that felt older than logic. The woman, Eleanor, watched the keys, her gaze shifting from the cold shimmer of metal to his face. Her expression remained maddeningly unreadable. Then, slowly, as if crossing a vast emotional distance, she reached out and delicately lifted the keys from his palm. Her fingers, shockingly cold, brushed his skin. The fleeting contact sent a strange jolt through him, half shock, half recognition, like touching a live wire wrapped in memory. She held the keys as if they were fragile relics, something sacred that might crumble if gripped too tightly. When she looked up at him again, the guarded wall behind her eyes finally fractured. "Thank you," she whispered. The gratitude in her voice was so profound, it seemed to pull the breath right out of the air between them. Ethan could only nod. His throat had gone tight and dry, words evaporating before they could form. He took an involuntary step back, instinctively creating the distance his mind desperately needed, and shoved his trembling hands deep into the safe harbor of his trouser pockets. The logical part of his brain immediately went into overdrive. What if she vanished? What if she sold the car for scrap? What if he never saw it again? By his standards, the luxury sedan was replaceable. Metal and leather bought with money, insured with paper. But that wasn't the point. The point was that he had just handed a functioning piece of his carefully controlled life to a complete stranger, relying on nothing but a seismic, irrational feeling. He cleared his throat, forcing steadiness into his voice. "I need it back by tonight," he said. "I have a 6 o'clock flight. No wiggle room." ... Eleanor nodded quickly, clutching the keys tighter, as if afraid they might disappear. "I'll bring it back," she said. "I promise. Cross my heart." ... Ethan wanted to trust her. Yet, he was a man who understood how cheaply promises were minted. People said whatever they needed to say to punch their ticket through a crisis. That was one of the first lessons success had taught him. "Where exactly are you headed?" he asked, surprised by the concern in his own voice. She hesitated, eyes dropping to the keys. "Just a place I used to stay. It's not far. Maybe an hour from here." ... Ethan frowned. "An hour? That's 2 hours round trip. You're cutting it close." ... "I know," she said softly, "but I'll make it. I have to." ... There was something in those last words, quiet, immovable, that stopped him cold. He didn't know what sacred obligation pulled her toward that place, and suddenly he realized he didn't want to. He had already leapt. There was no sense measuring the distance to the ground. "Okay," he said at last, the word landing strangely light in his mouth. "Parking garage. Section C. Row 12. Black sedan. License plate ends in 479. ... She repeated the details under her breath, committing them carefully to memory. Then she stood. Up close, she seemed smaller than he had first judged. He noticed the fine lines etched around her eyes, evidence of too many sleepless nights spent bracing for things she could not control. She tucked the keys securely into her jacket pocket and looked at him one last time, her gaze steady, searching. "Why?" she asked quietly. "Why are you doing this?" ... Ethan opened his mouth, but the elegant explanation refused to arrive. He couldn't articulate the faith that had guided his hand. He couldn't justify it, not even to himself. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. Eleanor nodded slowly, as if that bewildering honesty was the only answer she needed. Then she turned and walked toward the exit. She never looked back. Within seconds, she was gone. absorbed into the river of travelers and rolling suitcases, leaving Ethan standing alone as the roar of the terminal rushed back in around him. The airport, moments ago sharp and aggressive, now felt muted, as if someone had turned down the volume on the world. Ethan sank back into his seat, the hard plastic biting into his spine. A strange sensation washed over him, part relief, part vertigo. It felt as though he had deliberately cut the mooring lines of a perfectly stable ship. Something heavy had lifted, the crushing weight of self-absorption, but now he was adrift. His laptop sat open on his knees, the screen dim and accusing. He didn't touch it. He leaned back and closed his eyes, bracing himself against the merciless interrogation beginning in the back of his mind. What, in God's name, did you just do? The answer came, chilling in its simplicity. He didn't know. For most of his adult life, especially since the divorce, Ethan had been obsessed with architecture. Not buildings, but walls. After the custody battle, after watching his ex-wife carve away half of his peace of mind with surgical precision, he had decided that control was the only currency worth holding. He couldn't dictate the actions of others, but he could control his environment, his schedule, his distance from chaos, his insulation from pain. And it had worked. Mostly. His daughter, Emma, was thriving in college. His company ran like a Swiss watch. His life was efficient, predictable, free of messy entanglements. Yet lately, an emptiness had crept in, a yawning hollow that opened during the quiet hours when the spreadsheets were closed and the house was silent. He had always justified it. Loneliness, he told himself, was simply the price of stability. He was willing to pay it. But sitting here now, stranded between flights, stripped of momentum, he wondered if he had miscalculated the cost. That woman, Eleanor, had not tried to manipulate him. She hadn't dramatized her pain or wrapped it in performance. She had simply stated her need with a brutal honesty that bypassed every defense he had built. That was what cracked him. Not desperation, not spectacle, truth. Ethan checked his watch, just after 1 p.m. Nearly 5 hours stretched ahead of him. 5 hours to sit in this sterile limbo and wonder whether he had just made the most reckless mistake of his life, or the only decision that had mattered all day. He pulled out his phone. A dozen unread messages from his assistant blinked urgently on the screen. Updates on the contract, reminders for calls he was supposed to care about. He dismissed them all. Instead, he opened a blank note and carefully typed out his license plate number, just in case. He stared at the glowing screen, weighing his options. Should he call the police now, file a report, protect himself? Or should he finish what he'd started and trust the fall? He locked the phone and slid it back into his pocket. He didn't call. Time did not pass. It leaked. It seeped out of the afternoon in slow, colorless drops, each minute indistinguishable from the last. Ethan tried to work. He truly did. He reopened his laptop, forced his eyes across lines of legal language and revenue projections, but the words refused to anchor themselves. They slid off his mind like rain on glass. Every few minutes his gaze betrayed him, drifting back toward the exit that led to the parking garage. Where are you now? The question pulsed in his thoughts, unwanted and relentless. Had she found the car? Had she hesitated, standing there with the keys in her hand, battling the same terror he was now drowning in? Or had she driven off without a backward glance, disappearing into the anonymous sprawl of highways and exits? The thought should have ignited fury. It didn't. Instead, it brought exhaustion. By 2:30, Ethan closed the laptop again. Hard. He leaned back, staring at the high ceiling of the terminal, watching the light panels hum with artificial brightness. He had negotiated mergers worth hundreds of millions of dollars without breaking a sweat, yet here he was, undone by a woman whose last name he didn't know. He checked his watch. Still early. Too early. He stood and wandered toward the windows overlooking the parking structure, though he knew it was pointless. Section C was nowhere near this angle. Still, he stared at the concrete expanse as if his will alone might bend reality. Nothing. By 3 p.m. he began rehearsing explanations. It's just a car. Insurance exists for a reason. You didn't do anything wrong. You tried to help. The words felt thin, hollow, like arguments drafted by a lawyer who didn't believe his own case. He walked to the coffee shop, ordered black coffee he didn't want, burned his tongue on the first sip and welcomed the pain. It was something solid, something real. The line behind him pressed forward, people impatient to resume their motion, their momentum. Everyone was going somewhere. He was standing still. At 3:30, something shifted. Not panic. Acceptance. Ethan sat back down and let the truth settle, heavy and final. She might not come back. The realization didn't explode. It sank, quietly, deeply. He imagined the call to his assistant, the raised eyebrows, the careful, professional concern, thinly masking disbelief. He imagined the insurance forms, the inevitable lecture about exposure and protocol. He imagined the shark hearing the story and smiling, not with humor, but with recognition. He's slipping. Oddly, the thought barely stung. He had spent years fortifying himself against loss, yet this loss he hadn't even fully suffered yet felt different, less like theft, more like a wager. By 4 o'clock, the terminal seemed to close in around him. Every sound felt louder. Rolling luggage, boarding announcements, the shrill laughter of a group returning from vacation. Ethan relocated closer to his gate, telling himself it was practical. Boarding would begin soon. The truth was harder to admit. He couldn't bear to sit near the corner where he'd met her. That space felt charged now, heavy with what-ifs. Sitting there would mean reliving the moment over and over, and he wasn't sure he could survive another replay. He checked his phone. Nothing. At 4:15, anxiety tightened into something physical. A knot behind his sternum. A pressure that made breathing feel intentional. He stood again, pacing the length of the concourse, stopping only when he realized he was walking in circles. If she's going to return it, he told himself, it'll be soon. At 4:30, the lie cracked. By 4:45, it shattered. If she had planned to keep the car, she'd be long gone by now. If she'd hesitated, fear would have tipped her either way hours ago. The silence was an answer, just not the one he wanted. Ethan stood abruptly, driven by a need to confirm the worst. He walked toward the arrivals area, toward the garage exit, toward the physical space where disappointment could finally take shape. He stood there, watching the endless tide of humanity surge past, faces tired, distracted, forgettable, when his phone buzzed violently in his pocket. The sound was sharp, invasive. For a fraction of a second he considered not answering, preserving the illusion, delaying the verdict. Then, instinct took over. He pulled the phone out. An unknown number. The message was brief, clinical, almost unreal. Your car is in C12. Keys under front mat. Thank you. Ethan stared at the screen. Once. Twice. 3 times. The words didn't register immediately. His brain stalled, as if bracing for a trick. Then, sensation rushed back in all at once. Heat, light, sound. His pulse slamming against his ribs with sudden violent relief. She had come back, against all probability, against every cynical model he'd built of human behavior. She had kept her word. His fingers moved on their own, typing. Who are you? Before he could send it, another message appeared. Please don't look for me. Just know that what you did today saved me. You saw me as a person when no one else would. That means more than you'll ever know. Ethan froze. People brushed past him, muttering apologies or curses, but he stood rooted to the floor. He read the message again, slower this time, each sentence carving itself into him. Saved me. He hadn't fixed anything. He hadn't solved a problem or closed a deal. He had simply looked at someone and chosen to believe them, and somehow that had been enough. He turned sharply and moved fast, nearly jogging toward the parking garage. The air thickened as he descended, heavy with exhaust and cold concrete. His footsteps echoed down the ramp, loud and urgent. Section C, row 12. There it was, his car, sitting exactly where it belonged. Ethan slowed as he approached, heart hammering, as if the vehicle might vanish if he moved too quickly. He crouched and slid his hand beneath the front floor mat, tucked deep where no passing eye would notice. The keys were there. Cold, solid, real. He closed his fist around them and exhaled, a long, unsteady breath that felt like it had been trapped in his lungs since noon. She had been real. In a world governed by transactions and suspicion, he had extended trust, and it had been returned, intact. As he straightened, something loosened inside him. Not triumph, not victory, faith. Ethan didn't get into the car right away. He stood there in the parking structure, the keys clenched in his fist, staring at the black sedan as if it had crossed some invisible boundary while he wasn't looking. The concrete around him hummed with the low, indifferent vibration of engines and distant announcements bleeding in from the terminal above. Everything smelled faintly of oil, dust, and old rain trapped in cement pores. He opened the driver's door slowly. The interior greeted him with a familiarity that landed harder than expected. The muted scent of leather, the faint trace of pine from the air freshener he'd hung months ago and forgotten about. Nothing was disturbed. The glove compartment sat flush. The center console was exactly as he'd left it, a half-empty bottle in the side pocket, loose change resting in the cup holder. Proof she had driven the car, done whatever it was she needed to do, and brought it back untouched. Ethan lowered himself into the driver's seat and closed the door. The click of it sealing shut echoed through him, grounding and final. He leaned back, hands resting uselessly in his lap, keys still locked between his fingers. Only then did he notice it. A small rectangle of white against the dark fabric of the passenger seat. Paper. Folded once. Careful, intentional. His breath caught. Ethan reached across slowly, as if the note might vanish if he startled it, and picked it up. The paper was thin, torn from a notebook, the edge uneven. He unfolded it. The handwriting was neat, almost painstaking, each letter deliberate, controlled, as if the act of writing had required full concentration. He read the first line. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." The words landed with unexpected weight. He read on. "You gave me more than your car today. You gave me hope that kindness still exists. I went back to get something I left behind a long time ago. Because of you, I have it back now. I can finally start over. Please don't worry about me. I'll be okay. And I will never forget what you did." There was no name, no signature, just truth. Ethan stared at the note until the edges of the letters began to blur. A tightness spread across his chest. Not sharp, not panicked, but deep and unfamiliar. This wasn't anxiety. It wasn't relief either. It was grace, raw and unearned. He folded the note carefully, once, then again, smoothing the creases with his thumb, as if sealing something fragile. He slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket and pressed his palm there for a moment, feeling the paper against his heartbeat. He sat in the car longer than necessary, letting the silence wrap around him. Somewhere above, a plane roared into the sky, climbing toward destinations and deadlines. He didn't rush to follow it. Eventually he stepped out, locked the car, and headed back toward the terminal. The airport felt different now, not quieter, just clearer. As Ethan walked, he began to notice things he usually filtered out. An elderly couple sitting shoulder to shoulder near a charging station, sharing earbuds and smiling softly at something only they could hear. A young mother pacing with a crying baby, murmuring reassurances even as exhaustion sagged her posture. A man asleep in a chair, suit jacket folded over his briefcase like a guard dog. People, not obstacles, not background noise. People. He reached his gate just as boarding began. The line moved slowly, deliberately, everyone surrendering tickets and identification, like small offerings to motion. Ethan stepped into the jet bridge and felt the cool, metallic air brush past him. Inside the plane, he took his usual window seat. He didn't open his laptop. He didn't scroll his phone. As the aircraft pushed back from the gate, the sky outside ignited. Tangerine bleeding into rose, clouds catching fire along their edges. Ethan rested his head against the window and watched the light shift, realizing how rarely he ever did. The engines roared. The plane lifted. And with it, something inside him loosened. He replayed the day in fragments. The traffic jam, the missed flight, the corner of the terminal, the weight of keys in his palm. None of it had made sense on paper. None of it would survive a risk assessment. Yet, here he was, breathing easier than he had in years. He thought of the shark, of contracts and leverage and power plays. They could have the delay, they could have the optics. None of it mattered the way this did. Ethan closed his eyes, feeling the steady vibration of flight beneath him, and allowed a strange stillness to settle in his bones. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of trust. For the first time in memory, he wasn't trying to fix anything. He was simply letting it be. Ethan slept deeper than he had in years. Not the restless, half-conscious doze of a man whose mind never fully powers down, but a clean, uninterrupted descent into darkness. When he woke, sunlight was already climbing the glass of the hotel window, pale and deliberate, spilling across the unfamiliar room. For a few seconds, he didn't move. He lay there listening, to the hum of the city far below, to the muted thrum of traffic, to his own breathing. Something was different. The familiar tension that usually greeted him in the morning, the tight jaw, the preloaded urgency, was absent. He felt rested. The realization unsettled him more than exhaustion ever had. Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed and sat there, elbows on his knees, staring at the carpet as if it might explain what had happened to him. His suit hung neatly on the chair where he'd left it. His briefcase waited by the door, packed with notes, forecasts, contingencies. Everything was ready. And yet, for the first time in memory, the meeting ahead didn't feel like the axis around which the day would turn. He dressed slowly, methodically, buttoning his shirt without the usual mental checklist running in parallel. As he reached for his jacket, his fingers brushed the inside pocket. The note. He hesitated, then pulled it out. The paper was slightly creased now, warmed by proximity to his body. He unfolded it and read the words again, just once. That was enough. He folded it carefully and slipped it back where it belonged. Thank you for seeing me as a person. The phrase stayed with him as he left the hotel and stepped into the morning. The city was already alive. Horns, footsteps, construction noise ricocheting between glass towers. People streamed past him, purposeful and preoccupied, just as they always had. But Ethan noticed them now. Not as data points, as lives in motion. At the office tower, he rode the elevator up with a group of executives he didn't know. They checked their phones, adjusted ties, practiced expressions in the mirrored walls. Ethan watched them with a strange sense of detachment, as if he were seeing a ritual he'd once mastered but no longer fully inhabited. The meeting room was pristine. Polished table. Bottled water aligned with military precision. The city stretched beyond the windows, all ambition and geometry. The deal went through flawlessly. The clients were impressed. The terms were favorable. More than favorable, actually. The kind of agreement that would be dissected and admired for years. Hands were shaken. Compliments exchanged. Promises of future collaboration floated easily across the table. By noon, it was done. Ethan signed the final page and slid the pen back into his briefcase. He waited for the rush. It didn't come. Instead, there was a faint, disorienting emptiness, as if he had climbed a mountain he'd been training for his entire adult life, only to discover the summit was made of plastic. Outside, congratulations buzzed his phone. His assistant's messages stacked up quickly, full of relief and triumph. Investors chimed in. Board members used words like historic and transformational. Ethan replied politely. Efficiently. None of it reached his chest. He left the building and stood on the sidewalk, the city roaring around him. For a moment, he considered walking, just choosing a direction and following it, but habit won. He hailed a car and watched the streets slide by. Back at the hotel, he packed his bag without urgency. The flight home wasn't until evening. Time stretched open in front of him, unclaimed. He sat by the window again, the note resting heavy in his pocket, and tried to articulate the shift that had taken place. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't regret. It was awareness. He thought about how many times he'd won, how many contracts, mergers, negotiations had ended with him on top. He had collected victories the way some people collected art, carefully curated, displayed, admired. But yesterday had been different. There had been no leverage, no upside, no applause, just a choice. And the consequences of that choice were still unfolding inside him. On the flight home, Ethan found himself in a middle seat, boxed in by strangers. Normally, it would have irritated him. Today, he barely noticed. He watched clouds drift past the window, immense and indifferent, and felt oddly small in a way that didn't frighten him. When the plane descended, the city he knew so well spread out below, grids of light, familiar routes, predictable patterns. He collected his bag and walked through the terminal with an almost dreamlike calm. In the parking garage, he paused beside his car, the same one, the one that had been borrowed and returned. He rested his hand on the steering wheel for a moment before starting the engine, grounding himself in the physicality of it, the cool leather, the faint scent of pine. Then he drove home. The house greeted him with silence. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't open his laptop. He made a simple dinner and ate it standing at the counter, thinking of his daughter Emma, and the way she used to look at him when she believed he could fix anything. He wondered what kind of man she saw now. That night, as he lay in bed, the city quiet beyond the windows, Ethan understood something with a clarity that left him breathless. Success hadn't failed him. It had simply stopped being enough, and for the first time, he wasn't afraid of what that might mean. Ethan woke before the alarm, not because he had to, because his body did. The room was still dark, the house wrapped in that early morning hush he used to love only for its efficiency. Once, these hours had been his private advantage, the quiet stretch where no one interrupted, no one demanded, and the world felt pliable. Now, the silence felt different. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the familiar surge of urgency to arrive. The checklist, the pressure, the internal voice that insisted every minute must be optimized. It never came. Instead, his mind drifted, unbidden, back to the airport, to the way Eleanor's hand had trembled just slightly when she took the keys, to the look in her eyes when she asked why. "Why are you doing this?" He still didn't have an answer. Ethan swung his legs out of bed and padded into the kitchen. The floor was cold beneath his feet. He brewed coffee and stood by the counter while it dripped, watching steam curl upward like something alive. When had he last stood still long enough to notice that? He poured a mug and didn't open his laptop. That alone felt rebellious. He sat at the table, hands wrapped around the ceramic, and let his thoughts wander. Faces surfaced. The barista downstairs, who always remembered his order. The security guard in the lobby, who nodded every morning but never spoke. The woman who cleaned his house twice a week, quiet, efficient, nearly invisible. Functions, he realized. That was how he'd filed them in his mind. Roles, utilities, background, people he depended on, but never truly saw. The thought sat heavy. At the office later that morning, the change was subtle, but unmistakable. Ethan noticed it first in his own posture. He wasn't leaning forward, driving the room. He was listening. In meetings, he let pauses breathe. When someone spoke hesitantly, he didn't rush to finish their thought or redirect the conversation. He waited. It unsettled people. His assistant watched him closely, as if expecting a punchline. When Ethan asked how her weekend had been and actually waited for the answer, she blinked, startled, then smiled. "Good," she said. "Really good, actually." He nodded. "I'm glad." and meant it. At lunch, he didn't eat at his desk. He walked outside, took the long way around the block, let the city move around him instead of through him. He noticed the small things, the way light caught in windows, the sound of a busker tuning his guitar, the impatience in his own stride slowly loosening. None of it felt heroic, but it felt real. That afternoon, an email landed in his inbox, one of those messages he usually deleted without reading. A generic request, a minor inconvenience, someone asking for a small exception to policy. Normally he would have declined it with a form response. Instead, he read it twice. Then he approved it. The decision cost him nothing measurable, no loss of revenue, no exposure, no risk worth tracking. Yet when he hit send, something eased inside his chest, as if a clenched fist had finally relaxed. Driving home that evening, Ethan rolled the window down despite the chill. The air was sharp and clean, and he welcomed it. He passed the same streets he always had, the same intersections, the same routines, but they no longer felt like rails guiding him forward. They felt like choices. At a red light, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man staring back looked the same suit, same lines around the eyes. But something behind the gaze had shifted, less guarded, more present. That night he called Emma, not to check in, not to advise, just to hear her voice. They talked about nothing important. Classes, a roommate drama that made him laugh, a paper she was procrastinating on. When she asked how he was, he paused. "I'm figuring some things out," he said. She hummed thoughtfully. "That sounds good." ... After the call ended, Ethan sat in the quiet living room and realized his chest didn't ache the way it usually did after talking to her. There was no guilt, no sense of distance, just connection. He didn't know where this path led. He didn't have a 5-year plan for it. No benchmarks, no KPIs. But for the first time in a long while, Ethan wasn't trying to control the outcome. He was paying attention. And somehow, that felt like the beginning of something he'd been missing all along. The house was too quiet. Not the efficient silence Ethan once prized, the kind that let him think 3 steps ahead without interruption, but a deeper quiet, the sort that waited for something to surface. He noticed it most in the evenings, after dinner, after the dishes were done, after the lights were dimmed and there was nothing left to manage. That was when the walls spoke. Ethan sat on the couch with his phone face down on the table, resisting the urge to fill the room with noise. He didn't turn on the television. He didn't open a spreadsheet. He let the stillness press in, uncomfortable and insistent. Memories rose without warning. Not the highlight reel, the wins, the milestones, the carefully framed moments of success, but the quieter scenes he'd buried. The kitchen table, years ago, scattered with unopened mail. The sound of his ex-wife's keys hitting the counter harder than necessary. The way conversations had turned into negotiations, then into ceasefires. He hadn't meant for it to happen that way. He had just optimized everything. Problems became tasks. Emotions became inefficiencies. Love, slowly and quietly, became a variable he believed could be controlled. Until it couldn't. Ethan leaned back and closed his eyes, letting the truth form without interruption. He hadn't lost his marriage because he didn't care. He'd lost it because he cared too much, about preventing pain, about avoiding chaos, about ensuring nothing ever went wrong. Control had been his armor, and like all armor worn too long, it had eventually suffocated the person inside. He stood and walked down the hallway, stopping in front of the door he rarely opened. Emma's room. It was clean, preserved almost exactly as she'd left it. Bed made, desk neat, the faint scent of her shampoo lingering in the air. Ethan stepped inside slowly, as if entering a place of worship. On the desk sat an old photo frame. Emma, at 12. Missing a front tooth. Laughing so hard, her eyes were nearly closed. Her arms slung around his waist. Unself-conscious. Trusting. He picked up the frame and held it longer than necessary. "I didn't know how to stay," he said aloud, the words surprising him with their clarity. He'd thought distance was protection, that giving space meant giving freedom. But somewhere along the way, space had turned into absence. Ethan set the frame down and sat on the edge of the bed. hands resting on his knees. For years, he'd told himself the story that mattered most. I did my best. And maybe he had. But now, a harder truth pressed forward. He had done what felt safest, not what felt bravest. The realization didn't accuse him. It simply waited. Later that night, Ethan pulled out a notebook he hadn't used in years. Not a planner, not a ledger, just blank pages. He stared at the first page for a long time. Then he wrote one sentence. I am afraid of losing control because I don't trust myself with pain. He read it twice. The sentence felt like a key turning in a lock. He didn't write anything else. He closed the notebook and left it on the table, exposed, where he couldn't ignore it in the morning. As he prepared for bed, his phone buzzed softly. A message from his ex-wife. Nothing dramatic, just logistics. A reminder about an upcoming visit, a question about dates. Normally, he would have replied with precision and brevity. Tonight, he typed something different. Thanks for the reminder. Hope you're doing well. He hesitated before sending it, then pressed send. The reply came a few minutes later. You too. 2 words. But they didn't feel like a truce. They felt like an opening. Ethan lay in bed that night, the house quiet around him, and understood something that had eluded him for years. Control hadn't kept him safe. It had kept him numb. And numbness, he was learning, was far more dangerous than pain. For the first time, he didn't reach for armor. He let the quiet stay. Change didn't arrive with fireworks. It slipped in quietly, disguised as inconvenience. Ethan noticed it the following week, in places he normally dismissed as noise. A delayed meeting. A miscommunication between departments. A junior manager who hesitated too long before speaking, eyes flicking toward Ethan as if bracing for impact. Before, he would have cut in, corrected, redirected, optimized. Instead, he waited. Go on, he said gently. The room shifted. The manager exhaled and continued, words tumbling out more freely now. The idea wasn't revolutionary, but it was honest, and it was workable. When the meeting ended, several people lingered longer than usual, conversations stretching beyond agenda items. Ethan left the room with a strange sensation in his chest, momentum, without force. Later that day, he found himself in the lobby longer than necessary, exchanging a few words with a security guard whose name he finally learned was Miguel. They talked about nothing important, the weather, a local game, the way the city never really slept. As Ethan walked toward the elevator, he realized something unsettling. He felt lighter. That afternoon, an unexpected email landed in his inbox. Not from a client, not from the board, from human resources. A quiet report. A pattern. Exit interviews he'd never personally read. Words like burnout, unseen, replaceable, surfaced again and again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, the note from Eleanor warm in his jacket pocket like a steady pulse. He could ignore it, delegate it, file it under later. Instead, he asked HR to schedule time with him. The meeting was uncomfortable, not because anyone raised their voice, but because no one did. Stories emerged in careful fragments. Talented people leaving not because of pay, but because they felt invisible. Managers so focused on metrics, they forgot names. A culture that rewarded results while quietly draining the people who produced them. Ethan listened. He didn't defend. He didn't explain intent. He took notes, by hand. That evening, he didn't drive straight home. He pulled over near a small park he used to pass without seeing and sat on a bench as the sky darkened. A father pushed a swing slowly, methodically, matching his child's rhythm. A woman jogged past, breath steady, earbuds in. Somewhere nearby, laughter rang out and faded. Ordinary life. Unoptimized. Perfectly inefficient. Ethan thought about Eleanor again, not as a mystery, but as a mirror. How easy it was to disappear in a system built to move fast. How radical it was, sometimes, to simply stop and look. The next morning, he did something that would have been unthinkable a month ago. He rearranged his calendar, not to add more, to subtract. Standing meetings were shortened. A few were canceled entirely. He insisted on one-on-ones that had no agenda beyond. How are you really doing? People didn't know what to make of it, at first. Then something subtle began to ripple outward. Emails softened. Conversations lengthened. Laughter, actual laughter, slipped into hallways where only urgency used to live. Ethan didn't announce a culture shift. He embodied one afternoon as he walked through the office. He caught his reflection in a glass partition. The man staring back looked the same suit, same posture. But the eyes were different. They weren't scanning for threats. They were open. That night at home, Ethan took the notebook from the table and opened it again. He added a second sentence beneath the first. I am learning that presence is not weakness. He closed the notebook and left it there, unhidden. Change, he realized, didn't need permission. It just needed attention. The email arrived late in the afternoon, quiet and unassuming. Subject line, restructuring proposal, Q3. Ethan almost missed it. He was standing by the window when it came in, watching the city blur under a thin veil of rain. The glass reflected his face faintly, doubled and slightly distorted, as if the man he used to be was still trying to catch up. He opened the message. The proposal was clean, efficient, ruthlessly sensible, a consolidation of departments, a reduction in redundancies, a projected savings figure that would make the board nod in unison. On paper, it was the kind of move that earned respect, praised for discipline, for foresight, for courage masquerading as necessity. At the bottom of the document was a list. Names. Not positions, not headcounts. Names. Ethan felt the familiar instinct stir, the old reflex to evaluate impact, to calculate fallout, to weigh discomfort against margin. He could already hear the language that would be used in the meeting. Difficult decisions, market pressures, long-term health. He had spoken those words himself, more times than he cared to remember. He closed the document without replying. Instead, he printed it. The printer whirred softly, paper sliding out page by page. Ethan gathered the stack and carried it into the small conference room at the end of the hall, the one rarely used because it wasn't impressive enough for clients. He spread the pages across the table and read every name. Some were familiar. People he passed in hallways. People whose work he relied on but rarely acknowledged directly. Others were strangers, faces he might not recognize, but lives nonetheless bound to decisions he made from a distance. He thought of Eleanor, of how easily someone could vanish when the system decided they were no longer efficient. Ethan picked up his phone and called HR. I want to meet them, he said when the director answered. A pause. Meet who? ? All of them, Ethan replied. Individually, before we decide anything. ... Another pause, longer this time. That could take weeks, she said carefully. I know, Ethan said. Schedule it. ... When he hung up, his chest felt tight, not with fear, but with resolve. This was inconvenient, inefficient, impossible to spin as decisive leadership. It was also right. The meetings began the next day. They weren't dramatic. No tears, no raised voices, just conversations, sometimes awkward, sometimes halting, sometimes unexpectedly honest. A man who'd stayed late for years because he liked knowing things were done properly. A woman who had turned down another offer because she believed in the team. A young analyst who admitted he was already exhausted, but still hopeful. Ethan listened. He asked questions he'd never asked before. About families. About commutes. About what made work feel meaningful. Or meaningless. By the end of the week, the numbers looked different. Not worse. Different. The proposal didn't disappear. It changed. Roles shifted instead of vanished. Training budgets expanded. One department shrank, but another grew. The savings weren't as clean, but they were real. More importantly, the cost was no longer invisible. When Ethan finally sent the revised plan to the board, he didn't dress it up. He explained it. The response came faster than expected. Concern, pushback, a reminder of expectations. Ethan read it once, then twice. He typed his reply slowly. This version protects the company's future by protecting the people who make it run. It's not the fastest path. It is the most sustainable one. I'm willing to stand by it. He hit send and leaned back in his chair. For the first time, the waiting didn't feel like punishment. It felt like alignment. That evening, as he left the office, he passed Miguel at the security desk. Miguel nodded, then hesitated. "Hey," he said, "people are talking." Quote dot. Ethan smiled faintly. "That good or bad?" Quote dot. Miguel shrugged. "Different." Quote dot. Ethan stepped out into the rain, the city cool and alive around him. Different, he thought, might be the best outcome of all. The house was quiet again. But this time, it didn't feel empty. Ethan stood at the kitchen window, watching dusk settle over the neighborhood. Porch lights blinked on one by one. Somewhere down the street, a garage door rattled open. Ordinary sounds. Ordinary lives. He hadn't rushed home from the office. He hadn't stayed late either. The balance felt new. Fragile. Real. On the counter beside him sat the notebook. Open now. Pages no longer pristine. A few sentences lived there, scattered, unfinished. Not plans. Not goals. Observations. Presence is not weakness. Control is not care. People are not variables. He didn't know if anyone else would ever read those words. That wasn't the point. Ethan poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, thinking about the board's response earlier that day. They hadn't agreed with him completely. They never would. But they hadn't shut him down either. A precedent had been set. Not loudly, not heroically, but permanently. Systems, he was learning, didn't change because of speeches. They changed because someone chose to behave differently long enough that others had to adapt. His phone buzzed. A message from Emma. "Got a minute?" He smiled and called her instead. They talked about her classes, about a professor she admired, about a stupid argument with a friend that had already blown over. At one point, she laughed, unrestrained, easy, and Ethan felt something loosen in his chest. Before hanging up, she hesitated. "You seem different," she said, in a good way. Quote dot. He considered that. "I'm trying to be," he answered honestly. After the call ended, Ethan didn't move right away. He stood there, phone in hand, letting the moment land. He thought about Eleanor. Not where she might be now, or what her life looked like going forward. He had learned to let that go. Some stories were meant to intersect briefly and then diverge. What mattered was that, for a moment, two people had recognized each other as real. That recognition had rippled outward in ways neither of them could have predicted. Ethan walked into the living room and sat on the couch, the note still folded safely inside his jacket pocket. He didn't need to read it again. He knew the words by heart. "Thank you for seeing me as a person." He finally understood the weight of that sentence. To see someone wasn't passive. It wasn't sentimental. It was a decision, with consequences. It required time, attention, vulnerability. It required risk. For years, Ethan had believed that strength meant anticipating every outcome, controlling every variable. He had built a fortress so effective that even he couldn't feel its walls anymore. Now, standing at the edge of something more open, he understood what that fortress had cost him. Not success, but connection. Later that night, as he prepared for bed, Ethan paused at the hallway mirror. He studied his reflection. Not critically, not strategically, but curiously. The man staring back was still capable, still disciplined, still sharp, but he was also something else now. Available. Ethan turned off the lights and lay down, the house settling around him. Tomorrow would bring meetings, decisions, pressures. The world would not suddenly become kind or fair. But he would show up differently. And that, he knew, would matter. Because healing, he had learned, does not arrive through control or perfection. It arrives in the quiet moment you choose to trust, to see, and to act as if people are worth the risk. Ethan closed his eyes, breathing evenly, no longer bracing against the dark. For the first time in a very long while, he felt at home inside his own life,